Hey everyone, thanks for joining. My name's Noam. I'm with Rubrik. Today, we'll talk about trends that we're seeing with ransomware in the cloud, and we'll give three tips, three best practices to follow to try to handle ransomware. It will involve two general approaches. One is cyber preparedness, and the second is cyber recovery. Altogether, the approach that you should have is assuming breach. Let's deep dive. So what we're seeing in the industry recently is that despite high security spend, attacks continue unabated. Not only is security spend up, but also ransomware is going up as well. So what's going on here? If we want to specifically delve into cloud and looking into ransomware trends, this is what we've been seeing. Numbers are by Unit 42, Palo Alto. So what we've been seeing is that 71% of organizations have been hit by a cloud security breach in the last year. 30% of current attacks are against cloud hosted data. The average ransom demand is 7.6 million. And on average, and each organization can project its number according to this, but on average, $200,000 per day of downtime that is caused by ransomware in the cloud. So going back to where we started, you need to assume breach. You need to move from just trying to prevent the next attack to a resilience mindset. A resilience mindset resonates with assuming breach so that we can bounce back as fast as possible. Before that, let's just see how a breach actually happens. So the anatomy of a data breach always starts with a threat actor gaining some access. Now, once they gain the initial access, they might be able to find some low-hanging fruits in a dev environment, some data that was forgotten there. Because when they gain access, it might not be directly into the most sensitive environments. And then what they could find sometimes in these unmonitored, non-production environments could be just as sensitive. We call that shadow data. But still, when they're in dev, they will, in many cases, try to elevate permissions. They will try to expand their footprint. Then once they hit the sensitive production data, they could do one of the two things. They could try to exfiltrate the data, or they could try to destroy and encrypt the data. How do they actually gain access? So in many cases, it can be with a 0-day or an unpatched CVE. Sometimes it's just forgotten public access, public EC2, a public S3 bucket. But in many cases nowadays, it's through exposed credentials, it's through identity theft. And then they don't really need to hack, and they don't need to utilize a crazy 0-day. They just need to log in. So what would they do once they potentially just log in? So they'll try to authenticate, impersonate a legitimate user. The actual move, and a specific example could be listing all the back buckets in a target environment, trying to see which objects they can access, which they can't. And then which objects within these buckets, for example, actually have sensitive data. Then, especially in the double extortion attacks, they can combine the data exfiltrations through get object, copy object with data encryption. So we would think it could be a put object with an attacker key. What Codefingers showed us that they actually amazingly well and uniquely well used copy object with a server-side encryption. And that was a unique way of going about encrypting data. And that was very difficult to find without full bucket logging. And we'll touch on that. They could also go into data destruction. Again, in the recent ransomware attacks, deleting objects, putting lifecycle policies on the encrypted data so that after 7 days, if you don't pay the ransom, the data will get removed. So an incident could result in one of the two. It could result in data destruction, could result in data exfiltration. In the first case, you have cyber recovery. We'll touch on how you actually can achieve that. But the second case, if data has been exfiltrated, for that, we have the posture piece. And if you want to have a broad view and understanding of how I view posture, that is the preparedness aspect. Again, preparedness doesn't mean that we're assuming that you're trying to necessarily prevent the breach, but it's all about minimizing impact. Because if I'm prepared, I'm still assuming they'll be inside of the environment, but when they try to access, say, sensitive data, maybe that sensitive data will be harder to access. Maybe it won't be in those dev environments. We won't give attackers the low-hanging fruit. And that comes to preparedness, again under the assumption of assuming breach. So a comprehensive data-centric cyber resilience strategy is a must-have in order to minimize the impact of an incident, of a breach, and to avoid the double extortion. So 3 quick tips to complete cyber resilience, and I promise we'll deep dive on each and every one. But from a first glance and understanding, go back to the anatomy of a breach and think of how each and every section resonates with what we're seeing here. So first, you want to eliminate unnecessary data. Second, you want to limit and monitor identity access. Thirdly, is you want to make sure you're setting up recovery capabilities. Let's start with how do you actually eliminate unnecessary data? What does it mean for cloud? So we're seeing, especially around cloud, data sprawl is huge. It's the biggest advantage of cloud, that you can move, copy, change data. Data is being democratized. More people can use it, can access it. But just like we mentioned before, this creates huge risk for organization when there's more data, means that there's more, what we call the data attack surface is bigger, which is why you want to eliminate this unnecessary data. How do you actually achieve that? First, you want to be able to create a full inventory and track data as it changes throughout the environment. You want to be able to scan for sensitive data. If we're thinking AWS, it could be Macy, it could be a DSPM solution. Make sure that you truly understand your data. When I work with many organizations, it's not just about their PII, PCI, PHI. Many organizations have their own business-specific data. And then if you don't have the classification that understands context, or that context is a crucial part of it, then you won't necessarily have a full understanding of your business data. And then once you really gain an understanding of your data, once you know what data you have, if it's where it's supposed to be, you could start eliminating unnecessary and redundant data. Best case would be deleting the data, right? Then you would reduce the risk and reduce the cost. If you can't do that, well, at least maybe you can archive it to a lower tier where cost would be lower. And then rot data is what we're seeing with many organizations. Rot, if you don't know, is redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. So by understanding the data, you can highlight all the rot data. Again, highlighting rot data could A, help you remove that data, and B, by removing the data, you reduce the cost. Let's see tip number 2, limit and monitor identity access. So we've been talking about and hearing a lot about identity sprawl, but what's unique about the cloud, and especially nowadays, we're seeing not just the users and groups that can access data, but also non-human identities that can access this data. So what you want to be able to do is first understand which identities you have, limit their access to data, and if they do need to access sensitive data, well, you should monitor this access as well. How do you achieve that? Let's see. So first, by inventorying identities, you want to see which users you have, which groups, but which NHIs you have as well. Second part, audit access to this data. Then you want to reduce the access that these identities have. So think of it. With many cases of data, and I've seen a number recently, around 95% of data access to identities in the cloud is overprivileged, overprovisioned. There is no reason for it. If we think of all the data access grants we've provided, how many of those have we actually taken back, right? So think of how you can reduce this access, understand which are not just your admin and privileged identities, but which are your identities that can access sensitive data. Once you understand that, try to limit those as much as possible. And then Adopt best practices in the cloud. Don't just use users, switch to roles. Enforce MFA. Sometimes it's trivial, but highly recommend actually making sure that you're doing that. And you can use the IAM credential report, quite powerful. Take a look into that. Once we identify the identities, we want to monitor activity as well. So first, a lot of customers, when we have this conversation, they say, well, we can't monitor everything. And I agree with that. So what you want to do is you want to be able to focus on your critical data. So that resonates with what we said before with tip number 1, which was removing unnecessary data. But that starts with knowing your data. So by knowing your data, you can decide which assets you want to monitor. You want to monitor the activity on the assets, because I truly understand it's difficult to monitor absolutely everything. But once you focus on your critical data, now you can fully focus on any anonymous external activity. You can also find anomalous activities once you create a baseline understanding of how is this critical data being accessed. Now, once you do find an anomaly, you want to be able to quickly respond, remove the access, and you want to build that entire workflow. So the entire workflow is identifying sensitive data, knowing where to focus and have effective data access monitoring, and then combine a playbook and a workflow with your SIM, with your SOAR, so that you can immediately respond on that. Number 3, ensure the ability to recover. So you want to be able to find all your assets, find all your data. You want to understand, say, by analyzing different tags, which are your applications, which have different designations of critical apps or less critical apps. You want to create instant recovery and have data lifecycling. And this is key, right? You want to create cyber resilient copies. When we say cyber resilient copies, you want to make sure that A, these copies are immutable, and B, that if an attacker has gotten control over an account, you want them air gapped as well. When we say air gapped in the cloud, think could be in a different account, could be in a different organization altogether. And then even if the attacker's inside of the account, even if they got access, high privileged access to your organization, if it's in a different org, then it's separated from that environment. And you want to make sure that it's observable. You can understand where your copies are and it's easily monitored. You want to make sure that you can recover to a clean environment and to avoid reinfection. I'll give an example. If you're backing up EC2 machines, but those EC2 machines have been hit by malware, if you just reintroduce their EC2 machines, be it to a clean environment, those same EC2 machines has malware in it, you might be reinfecting the environment. So you need to be able to make sure that you have clean copies and that you're not reinfecting the environment. Lastly, efficient recovery. Granularity is sometimes key. You don't want to fully move your entire S3 buckets. Granularity is key. Understanding the configuration. And this is obviously to avoid toil. So how does Rubrik do it from a high level perspective on our architecture? So we got the Rubrik Security Cloud. This is our SaaS pane. And you can see to your right here, we have the Rubrik account where it allows us to connect through a cross-account role, and it allows us to run exocompute or lambdas, so it'll be compute running in the customer environment. This compute allows us to A, scan for the data, and B, move the data to wherever the customer chooses. So this can create A, an understanding of your data, and B, moving of your data. And Rubrik has a way to efficiently move large amounts of data. I highly urge anyone to have a look into what we're doing with huge amounts of data and the efficiencies that we get there. Secondly, we connect to, in AWS, for example, to your AWS IAM Identity Center to map the users and groups. We analyze all the different roles so that we map the different identities inside of your environment. Lastly, for example, in the S3 case, we can monitor S3 access activity through analyzing S3 server access logs so that we can monitor for this anomalous behavior. So the full cyber resiliency with Rubrik means A, data security for all your environments. In these examples today, I gave the example of Codefinger, so we talked about AWS. But think about your multi-cloud environment where how do you keep track of all this data? How do you make sure that you have immutable, air-gapped access control backups across multi-cloud. That is key. Second, you want to eliminate privilege creep and identify anomalous activity. So you want to identify and remove access to sensitive data where needed, and you clearly, where access is necessary, monitor access so that you can detect anomalous activity. You also want to confidentially achieve a near zero RTO by surgically recovering apps, files, or objects at scale. Lastly, Rubrik enables you to intelligently back up data and to optimize storage without maintaining expensive snapshots. Not only that, but we highlight what we call the rot data, redundant, obsolete, and trivial data, so that A, we remove the risk of unnecessary data in the environment, and B, we don't need the data. We obviously don't need to back it up, resulting in an altogether lower TCO and a very efficient play as well. Thank you very much for listening. Always happy to have a conversation. Feel free to reach out. I'd love to deep dive on each and every one of these topics. Thanks again for joining.